Hey everyone, this is Jace Marti from Shell's Brewery, and today I'm going to be making a mushroom pasta recipe. This is a recipe that I make quite often. I absolutely love it, and it incorporates beer, so even better. Super easy, comes together pretty quick, and it's definitely like a a luxurious type of a pasta recipe too. So yeah, we'll get started here. The star of the show is going to be the mushrooms. I absolutely love mushrooms. Mushrooms are just got a ton of flavor, and today we're just going to use just regular old brown button mushrooms, cremini mushrooms. They are readily available at the stores. They're cheap, easy to find. We're going to destem them. Pretty simple. Just peel them off with your fingers here, and then break them up. You know, the smaller ones kind of go into quarters. Don't have to get too particular in the sizes, but we're just going to break these up into smaller pieces so they're easy to work with. So the key with this recipe here, kind of guess one of the few tricks is, and anytime when you're cooking with mushrooms, is mushrooms have a lot of moisture in them, and you really want to get a good sear on them. That's what's really going to bring out a lot of the flavor. So a key with this recipe is kind of cooking over high heat, and to get that good, nice brown sear on them before you start to sweat out a lot of that moisture. Another thing too is, like I said, mushrooms are flavor sponges, and they are going to absorb a lot of moisture. So when you're cleaning mushrooms, especially with these creminis here, don't wash them. Do not wash them. All that water, if you run them under the sink, is just going to absorb into the mushroom. You're going to have a hard time really getting that good sear on them. So you keep them dry as much as possible. You don't want to add any additional moisture to the mushrooms. That's really going to hamper the flavor development in this recipe. So got these all prepped, ready to go. I'm gonna put them back into my bowl here. This recipe I'm gonna use 2 shallots. You can use yellow onions. They're pretty much interchangeable. Yellow onions are gonna have a little more kind of a sharpness to them, a little bit more bite. Shallots are going to be a little sweeter, a little milder. So with this recipe, to kind of let the mushroom shine, I'm going to go with shallots in this one. So cut them the same way you would a yellow onion. So if you know any knife skills, how to save your fingers. So middle finger first, next 2 fingers kind of behind it. So we're going to cut some nice thin cuts lengthwise of the shallots. Keep the roots intact, and then we're going to go cut some crossways. Do 2 cuts there, and then again kind of use that knuckle of your middle finger to go right along the blade of the knife, and that's how you're going to get that nice fine chop of the shallot there. So do the same thing with the other one. Couple cuts sideways, and then again you get your nice fine crosshatch. I'm gonna add this back to my little bowl here. Next up is the garlic. So in our household, we love garlic. No vampires here. So I'm gonna go probably heavy on the garlic. If you don't like garlic as much as I do, you can definitely dial it back. So I'm gonna use 6 cloves of garlic. Cut the ends off, give them a good pop, and then we're just gonna finally dice those. So, got my garlic ready. Gonna add that to the bowl here. And then finally, the last thing, I'm gonna chop up some parsley here. So parsley is just kind of gonna be the way to finish the dish. So I pre-washed this already. Don't need a ton of it. It's just kind of a way to finish the dish. So just take the nice leaves, wash it ahead of time, and we're gonna dice this up. This is just gonna be a way to finish the dish when we're all done with it. All right, we are ready to go. And now we're going to get started with our pasta water and getting the pot ready. So first thing we want to do is get our water going. So I got a pot full of water, and I have our pan going here. So like I said earlier, kind of a key with cooking mushrooms is you want to get a good sear on them. So I'm going to preheat this pan. I don't want to go super hot, but we want to be pretty hot, like a medium-high heat. We want to let this pan preheat, get a good, nice heat all the way through the pan. That's going to be key. You don't want to just blast it with high heat and then try and put some on there. You're going to smoke off your olive oil, and you're going to end up burning your mushrooms. So I'm going to go about medium-high heat, depending on what your stove is. I have a gas stove. Mine burns pretty hot, so that's kind of where I like to cook it. And we're going to let that preheat. Give it a couple minutes. You'll get that time back as you're cooking. The other thing, we're going to use olive oil here, about a quarter cup. Olive oil, that's the fat in the recipe. Fat is really kind of the medium that delivers the flavor. So there's a really great cooking book that I like called Salt, Fat, Acid, and Heat. And this recipe really incorporates all those 4 kind of pillars of building flavor here. And so fat, kind of the medium of the flavor. We're going to use some olive oil here. We're also going to use some butter later on in the recipe, kind of get both fats. But make sure you're using a good, high-quality olive oil. It's really going to make a difference here in the recipe. Bring my mushrooms over here. So got that pretty good heat. Okay, so I got my pan preheated here, about a quarter cup of olive oil, and I'm going to pour that in. I know it seems like a lot, but mushrooms, like I said, they're kind of like sponges, so they're really going to absorb a lot of this, the olive oil here. So you'll know when your pan's properly preheated, you'll start to kind of see this glossy sheen on the olive oil, and you'll also start to see a little wisp of smoke. So we'll just give that a second here, make sure the pan is good and hot. And the other thing too is I'm using about a pound of mushrooms here, and it seems like it's a lot, but they're going to shrink way down. So don't worry about like overcrowding your pan, but maybe because these are the bigger mushrooms, you might want to start with just adding half of them first. Let them cook a little bit, get a good sear on them. They're going to start to shrink immediately, and then add the rest of them too. You don't want to steam the mushrooms. Like I said, there's so much moisture in them that you want that good sear. And if you can really end up kind of flooding the pan with them, you'll end up kind of steaming half of them as you're searing them. So I'll just start with kind of a couple handfuls here, and you can see that they're cooking right away. And it looks like I'll have enough room, so I'm just going to add them all right away. And I'm going to give these a good mix, and then we're going to let them sit. While these are cooking and the water's heating up, I'm going to talk about the other star of the show, and that's the beer. So the beer we're going to be using today is Static Transmission, and this is one of our sour beers at Shell's Brewery. This is a kind of a separate line of beers that we're doing. That's made at our Star Keller, and it's all beers that are made in wooden tanks, and it kind of blurs the line between beer and wine. Think of like a champagne type of a beer. They're going to be a little more acidic, kind of have a tartness to it, and that's why these beers are going to work really great when you're cooking. So everybody knows, that wine, cooking with wine is definitely a thing. Cooking with beer is absolutely a thing as well. There's just a few things that you need to know when you're cooking with beer. A big one is that you don't want to use beers that are really hoppy. Hops lend the bitterness in beer that balances out the sweetness that you get with malt. And if you're going to use a really hoppy beer in something like this where we're making a sauce and it's going to reduce down, that bitterness is going to intensify to the point where it gets really unpleasant. So anytime you're using some kind of beer in like a sauce or something like that, you want to make sure that it's either very lightly hopped or very, very malty. And in this case, we're using a sour beer. Sour beers have basically no bitterness at all, no hops. They're just malt, and then they age for a long time, and you get this nice bright acidity, lactic acidity. And when we're using in this recipe, it reduces down. It's going to add some acid to the flavor of the dish, which is going to really add a brightness to the dish as well. Another great thing about these sour beers is we use a wild yeast. It goes through a wild fermentation, and if anyone has had like natural wines where you get a little more of this rustic kind of farmhouse, even like a funk character to them, you're going to get that with our sour beers. And when you're cooking with mushrooms, they just work so well together. They really play nicely. So that's why I chose this beer specifically, but you can use a lot of any of our sour beers really. So I've been letting these go for a couple minutes. Don't stir them a whole lot, but starting to get this nice good browning on the mushrooms. I'm going to add the garlic and the shallots. So I'm going to start with, I'm going to add 2 tablespoons of butter, New Ulm's own AMPI, of course. And the reason I'm adding butter later is because butter will, you know, with this kind of a long sear, butter will start to burn. And so I'm just going to use the olive oil first, and then I'm going to incorporate the butter afterwards. And then I'm going to add the shallots and the garlic. And these are going to cook pretty quick because, you know, obviously we got a lot of heat in the pan going. And so we want to stir these around a lot because they are going to cook pretty quick. Now we get to add the fun part. Star Killer line of sours, they've been around. We launched the program in 2012. So this year's our 8th year, obviously with COVID and everything. Kind of been a bummer, but we have switched to 375 milliliter bottles down from the 750s. And the reason we started with those, the 750s, is because all the styles of beer that we make in this are based on the Berliner Weiss style of beer. It's a type of German sour beer, obviously originates from Berlin. And there it kind of has the nickname as the Champagne of the North, or the People's Champagne. And so we kind of took that literally with the champagne look and feel of it with the cork and cage finish. But part of that too is also practical. It's a very historic style of beer. It's been around for hundreds of years. And because it goes through a wild fermentation and yeast and bacteria weren't really well understood hundreds of years ago, they noticed that when it was in the bottle that this beer would get this really intense carbonation. I mean, almost, you know, very champagne-like. And when you would pour it in a glass, because it's beer and beer makes a lot of foam that lasts for a long time, and you'd get this crazy, you know, voluptuous foam head on the beer. So they would always serve it in these massive, almost look like big chalices, because it would foam so much. And that was part of the reason why you would also package it in a champagne bottle, is because it could handle that intense volumes of CO2. Nowadays, we know that really high CO2 that you'd get was caused by the wild yeast Brettanomyces breaking down a lot of those non-fermentable dextrin sugars, and you let the beer age long enough where it stabilizes and you can package it where it becomes a very stable package. So that's a very long explanation why we used a certain bottle versus the other, but with kind of changing consumer preferences, we switched to a 375, more of a single serving, a little bit more accessible. So got a good brown here. Looks like my shallots and garlic have sweated out, starting to get a little bit of color here. So I'm going to add the beer. So we don't want to add a ton. Maybe just give it a good swirl. And like Julia Child, some for the chef as well. And now we're going to reduce this down. And like I talked about, it's got really complementary flavors here. And with these mushrooms kind of being like sponges, a lot of that moisture is going to suck into the mushrooms, and you're going to get this really intensely flavored mushroom character. So now that we kind of added some of the beer, reduce that stock down, we're going to salt it a little bit, but we don't want to do too much because we're going to incorporate some of the pasta water into the dish later on, and that's going to be very salty. So little light on the salt for now. You can always add more later. You can't take it out. But then give it a couple good twists of pepper. I like it well seasoned. So, and I'm going to turn this down a little bit because it's looking pretty good right now. And we're going to switch to our pasta. So I have a good rolling boil here, and I'm going to salt it pretty heavily. Most of the salt is just going to stay in the water. So salt it pretty heavily, so because you want a lot of that to incorporate into the pasta. I'm going to use just regular fettuccine, store-bought, pre-made stuff. I love making pasta at home. It's super easy to make. A couple eggs, some flour, and a little bit of salt. Roll it out flat. But in this case, I'm just going to use some pre-made store-bought stuff. So I'm going to put that in. And this pasta is 4 minutes till al dente. But with this recipe, we are actually going to we're gonna finish the pasta off in the sauce. So I'm gonna set a timer for 3 minutes because I wanna finish the pasta in the sauce when we're done. With this recipe, now kind of as the sauce is still going here, I kind of talked about the 4 pillars of flavor development: salt, acid, fat, and heat. I have a little bit more cream that we're going to add to kind of make this a really rich, kind of decadent, luxurious type of a pasta to it. But we don't want to drown it in the cream. We also don't want to add it too soon because with the high heat it can kind of get almost a little greasy. So we're going to add that right before the pasta is ready. I'm also going to add a little lemon juice. So I just have a regular lemon. I'm going to add a squeeze of this. Get rid of the seed here. And like I said, acid's kind of it's like a spotlight. It highlights the flavors. Where salt's kind of that amplifier, acid's really going to bring out, highlight a lot of those flavors. We're going to get some of the acid with the static transmission, kind of that sour beer, but I like a little bit more of a pop with the lemon juice. You can also, if you want, add a little bit of lemon zest, just because we have it here. Okay, so pasta is just about ready. Now I'm going to add the cream. Like I said, don't want to overcook this too much, but we also want to have a nice rich sauce to it. So right before the pasta is ready, I'm going to add the cream, give that a good stir. And like I said, I turn the heat down because you don't want to overcook the cream too much. But we still want to have our pan nice and hot. So, and we're not even going to drain the pasta here. We're just going to lift this up and dump it into the recipe. So we're going to have a lot of residual salt water that's going to carry over here. And that's another little trick, is pasta water. Pasta water is kind of like liquid gold when it comes to making sauces. You're going to have a lot of residual starch in there, and that's what's really going to help thicken up that sauce a little bit. So start to get it kind of on the, covering all the noodles. And then I'm going to take just a little bit of pasta water and incorporate that in. And we're going to reduce that down. That's going to really help thicken up that pasta sauce. You also have the butter in there kind of that we added at the end. That's going to really help give you that nice glossy sheen on the noodles and really make it a rich looking pasta. So I'm going to let that go for just a minute here, and then we're going to bring it over and we're going to let that cool for a second too. That's all going to help thicken up that pasta. That's looking pretty good, pretty well reduced. So I'm going to turn that off and I'm going to bring that over. We're going to let that cool for a minute. At home, if you're trying to, entertain anybody, guests or anything like that, really the kind of the 3 keys to a successful pairing, we call it the 3 C's. So that's cut, contrast, and complement. That's what you're looking for to have a really successful pairing. So this recipe definitely hits on some of those notes. So I'll kind of talk about those briefly. The first one is cut. So foods that are really intensely rich, fatty, something like this where we're making this really intensely flavored pasta. You want something that's bright and acidic that's going to cut through that fat. It kind of refreshes your palate as you're having a bite of food and you go to the beer. It kind of cleanses your palate, gets you ready for another bite. That's an example of a cut. Second one would be a contrast. If you think of like sweet and sour, that's a contrast. So you're going to get this, with this beer here, nice bright sourness. If you had something really sweet, if you're thinking like barbecue, something that's going to have, intense sweetness to it, that would be an example of a contrast. The third one is a complement. And I talked a little bit about that too if you're using chanterelle mushrooms. You get that kind of apricot flavor that is naturally found in the mushrooms. You could complement that with an apricot flavored beer. Another one is, say you're using like a dessert, something that's really chocolatey with like a really intense, like a stout or something really rich like that. That would be, chocolate and chocolate. They just play off each other, they amplify one another, and you just kind of go back and forth between one and the other, and it's a really, really cool flavor experience. So yeah, so I kind of plated the pasta from here, put some mushrooms on top, sprinkle a little parsley there just for a nice pop of color. I got some Parmesan cheese, add a little more creaminess to it. That's going to melt really nicely over the top of the pasta. Quick crunch of pepper. And there you have mushroom pasta. Cheers. So I hope you enjoyed this recipe. I hope you enjoyed a little bit of the beer knowledge I shared with you. So definitely try and make this recipe at home. If you can't, stop by and see us at Shell's Brewery or at the Star Killer. Cheers.